All right, good afternoon. I'm Mark Wollstonecroft. You all know Robin Ryan. We're going to round out this afternoon, bring us to the end with the presentation regarding cybersecurity. Now, I just want to start by a mental picture. It's your mental picture of a hacker. I think they're all wrong. You've seen Jurassic Park? Everybody knows Newman from Seinfeld. Do you remember Newman's role in Jurassic Park? He was the hacker, the guy who was typing away on the computer, frantic with his hair all frazzled. He was a real cyber geek. I want to be crystal clear up front. I am not a cyber geek.
But nobody said you're not a geek. All I'm saying.
Well, there's various types of geeks, Robin. Thanks for pointing that out. I am an auditor, and John clearly announced from the podium this morning that I enjoy complex accounting topics, so I probably fit in some sort of geek profile, but certainly not the cyber geek profile. Robin and I are both business consultants and auditors, and like many of you, we're comfortable with business topics, accounting topics. So when I was asked to talk about cybersecurity, I was a little bit anxious about that because I'm not a cyber geek. I wouldn't know how to hack a system. I can do Microsoft Word, I can do Excel, I can do a pivot table, all that fun stuff like you can. But when we start to talk about programming and networks, and it gets a little bit beyond what I'm comfortable with. So originally I was a little uncomfortable with talking about this topic. But the more we researched it and we thought about our audience here this morning or this afternoon, the more I got comfortable with the topic. And the reason for that is, at least most of the folks that I know in this room aren't cyber geeks either. But most of our organizations really look to us to make sure that money isn't going out the door that shouldn't be going out the door. So we really all have some responsibility to guard against cyber attacks. And so I think it's good for us to talk about how we can do that, absent the cyber geeks. So by way of this presentation, we plan to cover the current climate with respect to cyber crimes, some of the methods that cyber criminals employ, and some ideas on what can be done at your organizations really to help protect your organization from cyber fraud. I'm going to really spend the first portion of the presentation talking about some statistics and some studies that have been done around the issue, and then Robin's really going to bring us home at the end and talking about practical ideas for our organization. There really isn't any one-size-fits-all solution to cyber threats, but there are meaningful actions that we can take, and they're not high-tech actions, but they're really built around discipline, and we'll talk about those. So I want to start with a quick poll. How many people in this room have been the target of cyber fraud? I bet you we should all have our hands up right now. Whether it involved a Saudi prince that wanted to send you cash, a lonely Russian bride-to-be, or someone posing as an IRS agent, I bet you we've all received emails, people trying to get us to respond, people trying to entice us. And some of these fraudsters are really good. They know how to use target attacks that play on our fears and impose a sense of urgency. So I want to start with a story. Some of you know my wife, and I have her permission to tell this story. And I know it's on tape, so She may see it someday, so I'll be kind. But Judy is a strong, quiet, patient mother of 4 who has a deep faith. I'm blessed to have her in my life. Judy starts the morning. Her morning usually starts around 4:30 in the morning. She gets up and she runs. And after she runs, she does a devotion. And then after she does her devotion, she does family calendar stuff and preparation for the day. She tries to get that all done before the little kids get up. A little over a year ago, Judy was in her routine. She was preparing for a Bible study she was doing at the church that evening. She was doing some preparation, some research on the computer, when all of a sudden, Microsoft was contacting her and said that there was an issue with our computer. They told her that over the internet, on our computer, that she should contact them immediately so that they could resolve the pornographic images that were on our computer. Of course, Judy was preparing for a Bible study. She was mortified by the idea that this would be on our computer. And meanwhile, she knew the little kids were going to be getting up shortly, and she wanted to get this resolved as soon as possible. So she called the number. She called the Microsoft number. And the gentleman on the line was very kind and said he knew he could help her if she would just give him access to our computer via GoToMeeting. Judy knows better than to give this guy access, but she was frazzled, she was in a hurry, and she gave him access. And then about 10 seconds after she gave him access, she realized, oh boy, this is bad. So she closed the window, shut off the computer, unplugged the computer, and fortunately, we didn't sustain any harm. We needed a new computer anyway, and and we really should have been updating our passwords anyway, so we went through an extensive password update and got a new computer, and everything's okay. But that's really the heart of cybersecurity. The bad guys really want access to your computer, and a lot of times they need your permission to get that access. So we're going to talk a little bit about how they might try to get access and some of the problems that can come along with that. So that leads nicely into this next slide. A lot of times when we think about cyber fraud, we're thinking about the financial considerations. And there certainly can be financial considerations when it comes to cyber fraud, and we'll talk about some of the statistics in a few minutes. But there can be other issues too. There can certainly be reputational issues. If your company's data is compromised and you have to notify customers that their data was compromised, that's not a fun thing. It can have reputational issues. There can be operational issues. I very recently bid on some 401k work, and they told me that, Mark, will it be a problem that we can't get to last year's personnel records because we had a ransomware attack and they ransomed our payroll records. So depending on what they ransom, it can have operational issues for you too. And then there are regulatory issues that Robin will touch on a little bit later too with respect to reporting. So I want to talk about a few statistics. These statistics come from a CPA journal article from June of 2019. So in 2019, cybercrime cost over $3 trillion. And it's estimated to be $6 trillion by 2021. $6 trillion would represent 7% of worldwide GDP. It would make cyber fraud the third largest component behind the United States and China in terms of the world economy. So it's important. It's real and it's important. In the US, ransomware costs alone have grown from $25 million in 2014 to $8 billion in 2018. 70% of cyber attacks are aimed at small and medium-sized companies. I know a lot of people, when you talk about cybersecurity, you think of some of the big breaches that have happened with major banks, major credit cards, but really 70% of these attacks are aimed at small and medium-sized companies, a lot of the companies that are represented in this room today. I recently read that 15% of middle market companies experienced a data breach last year alone. This slide talks a little bit about median cost. The article said the median cost for entities with under 25 employees was $690,000. It was $1.1 million for entities with over 100,000 employees. That's more than what I've seen in practice, but it's still an interesting data point and a concerning data point. Okay, I want to talk about, I have two studies, and I'm not going to dwell on these studies, but I want to walk through them pretty quickly just to give you a flavor of what's going on. So this 2018 Ponemon Institute study really focused on people that are on the front lines of cybersecurity. So these are a lot of CIOs at companies, a lot of companies that would be bigger than we're dealing with, but still good data points. This study gave us 7 problematic trends that are expected over the next 3 years, and as well as some improvement trends. So the problematic trends, they said, a data breach from an unsecured Internet of Things device in the workplace is very likely in the next 3 years. We talked about Internet of Things a couple times today already. Most of those were good points of Internet of Things, but there's certainly issues with respect to security that could cause issues. The risk of cyber extortion and data breaches, they feel, is going to increase. These IT security practitioners are more pessimistic about their ability to protect their organizations from cyber threats. And cyber warfare and breaches involving high-value data will have the greatest negative impact over the next 3 years. Those are the first 4. They also said that cybersecurity is not considered to be a strategic priority in organizations, and board of directors are not engaged in oversight of cybersecurity matters. They felt that organizations need to spend more to achieve regulatory compliance and may need to spend more to respond to class action lawsuits or tort litigation. So this is certainly not a rosy picture. The study also indicated that the mean time to identify a breach is 197 days, and the mean time to contain a breach is 69 days, which are long periods of time. On the flip side, on the improving trends and predictions, they felt that as the threats increase, organizations are expected to more heavily rely upon their CISO's experience. They felt that governance practices will improve, and they felt that folks in these IT positions were really going to have greater authority and responsibility. I read this to say it's going to get bad enough that organizations are going to be forced to react. They also thought that organizations will invest in enabling these security technologies, and that there would be improved collaboration across organizations to reduce complexity of the business and IT operations. One thing that struck me about this study, at the same time I was reading this study, I was reading some articles, and the articles were saying that in the middle market, most CEOs feel that they've taken the necessary precautions relative to cybersecurity, and they're increasing in their confidence with respect to cybersecurity. So what struck me was the gap in the confidence that's happening versus what the IT folks are saying about risks. The next study, go back one more here. Yeah, here we go. The next study I want to talk about briefly is the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report. This is a 2019 report. It tells us a little bit about who's behind the attacks, who are the victims, and what tactics are being used. So who's behind the attacks? 69% was from people outside of the organizations. 34% of the attacks involved internal actors. And not surprising when you hear about the news, 39% were caused by organized criminal groups, and 23% were actors identified as nation-state or state-affiliated. Who are the victims? 16% were public sector entities, while 43% involve small business victims. So I think that tells us that this is an issue, for our attention. What tactics are being used? 62% featured hacking, 33% were social attacks, 29% used malware, and only 4% involved the presence of physical actions. Most of them were truly cyber actions. I think what this tells us is we really need to find a way to help businesses and help our employees avoid these social attacks, strengthen passwords, avoid hacking. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Another important way that criminals are getting access to our systems is what's referred to as business email compromise. As I mentioned, these are scams where the bad guys are trying to get into our systems via our emails. And we've all received the emails where they're trying to get you to click on a link. A lot of times they look very legitimate. A lot of times they look like they're coming from Microsoft or they're coming from someone that you do business with. These are often known as phishing scams. The FBI considers this to be the most costly form of cybercrime. It really begins with the download of malware, which may be an attachment or a link that downloads when you click on a link in your email. And what happens is that the fraudster can monitor your email activity and determine a plan of attack. Personally, I've seen a few clients affected by this in recent years. In one case, a criminal hijacked a legitimate email chain between our client's accounting department and a customer. So they got right in the middle of the email chain. And the client had been emailing back and forth. And they advised, the fraudster advised the accounting department that the bank account had changed and that all future payments should be sent to this new account. And so our client didn't think much of it because they had been emailing with this person already. And as a result, the payment was wired to this new bank account. And then several months later, or a month later, the vendor said, "Hey, what's going on? Why haven't you paid us?" And our client said, "We did pay you." And there was, a very real loss to our client in that situation as a result of making a payment to this new bank account. In another case, a criminal posed as the CEO of our client. He sent an email to the CFO and asked that some cash be wired to a specific vendor in a specific amount. This criminal even knew that our client had a secure token set up with the bank. So he said, "Please, I know I'm not here today. Please go into my office, get my token, use the token to wire the funds." Fortunately, very quickly after our client had wired the funds, they ended up getting a call from the CEO, unrelated, And he said, hey, I sent that money you asked me to send. And the CEO said, what money? So in that case, they were actually able to contact the bank, and the bank was able to stop the transaction because it happened so quickly. But that's pretty rare. In each of these cases, I think the hackers were pretty sophisticated. They must have gotten access to the systems through some sort of malware. They must have been monitoring the email communications, and they picked a time that was well suited to get our client to take the action that they wanted to take. We believe that they did this by configuring Microsoft Outlook. You can set up rules in Microsoft Outlook so that when you send an email, it will blind copy someone else. And we believe that essentially the hackers were getting all of the emails and were well posed to pounce when the time was right. So I'm hoping that the first section here demonstrates that this is an issue that warrants the attention of folks in this room. If you're like some of the folks that I've presented on this topic before, you may still be recovering from the 7% of GDP number, which is staggering. But there is good news, and Robin's going to share some of that good news. But I'm just going to leave you with this thought about cybersecurity. We've all heard the joke about the two friends that were in the woods, and they came upon a bear. And both of the friends got down on one knee. And the first friend started to pray. And the second friend tied his shoes. And the friend that was praying said to the friend that was tying his shoes, why are you tying your shoes? You're never going to outrun that bear. And the fellow that had just tied his shoes says, I don't have to outrun the bear. I just have to outrun you. And I think in some respects, cybersecurity is like that. We might not have perfect systems, but we better make sure we're doing more than our peer group so that we're less likely to experience the attacks. Over to you, Robin.
All right, thank you, Mark. Let me just say I have received some of those funky phishing emails. I am apparently less gullible than Judy, who, by the way, is a lovely woman, because when I get the emails threatening to expose the pornography they have of me or the pictures they have of me, I look at those emails, I'm like, dude, come at me, because I lead the most boring life on the face of the earth. Your chances of getting a buck out of me are nothing, because I know how boring I am. I may be boring, though, but I will say, as an accountant, I'm a little less geeky than most. All I'm saying. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about, I'm covering the tactical side of this, so as we continue to talk about BEC. So again, what are the most important things you can be doing? Number one, ongoing education, whether it's for yourself personally or more importantly, I also, by the way, talk a lot faster than Mark, so I should get us out of here in time. Most importantly, to your employees, your staff, or anybody that has access to your system. Because the problem is, people are nice, people are good, people are naive, they don't think. So be aware that ongoing education, I will probably mention this 6 times, it is the most important thing you can do for yourself and your business. Secondly, as Mark alluded to, you need to verify requested changes in account and routing numbers. So when you get that email that says, hey, send it to this account, don't hit reply to verify, because some people are like, oh, I'm going to check on this. They hit reply. What they don't realize is the fraudster has an email address that looks exactly like the one they were used to using with maybe some little tweak. So at that point, you need to be considering picking up the phone, making a phone call, or a separate email to an email address that you know works. Again, following up on unusual requests and the Outlook rules. I took a seminar with the FBI a couple months ago, which sort of opened my eyes to this. And when he brought up what they're doing with Outlook rules, it just floored me. How often, okay, maybe just me doesn't check my Outlook rules, but you don't think about it. But they get in there and they put rules in, and all your emails are going to them, and they're monitoring and they're watching, and then that's how it allows them to set up these emails, these fake emails. So, if you do nothing for yourself, check those Outlook rules. And then the last one is, If you're using Gmail or you have a Comcast account, those are very easy for them to hack. Now, there are provisions within those systems, and don't ask me what they are, that allows you to sort of essentially add those layers of security. So if you were using Gmail to send any kind of sensitive information, please be careful and make sure you know what you need to do to protect yourself if you're using those kind of providers. So there's two more examples here.
I'm gonna give you that. That's a good clicker.
Oh, okay. This one here, People Inc. was a nonprofit. So interestingly enough, they had over 1,000 current and former clients with medical records that were hacked. Remember, while they like money, they can sell information. So it isn't necessarily just the money they're looking for. You know, as CPAs, we have people's EIN numbers, we have their social security numbers. So I think we are incredibly cognizant of that. But you know, sometimes if maybe you have a medical practice, some of your staff may not recognize that they're just as happy to have the medical information because again, that can be sold and then that can, you know, there's money involved. So, and that's what happened here. Again, they went into two different email, actually it says here an email account, but when I was doing some reading, there were 2 people that were exposed. And basically it was a weak password. So once they were able to set up new passwords, you know, it added a layer of prevention. I think this worked more. Okay, this one here is interesting because this goes, I don't know how to pronounce that. That was actually a cyber network, and they took 2 different kinds of malware, sort of brought them together, and they went in and they did, think about this, $100 million worth of attack damage. They were using banking, online banking, and they were using the phishing emails to get people in the United States and outside of the United States. They did catch these guys. There were at least 10 of them, but you know what? They're smart and they're creative. We'll leave it at that. So again, protecting your organization. We're going to go through some tactics here. What I want you to start with is I want you to think in terms of big picture. Well, I'm going to give you some tactics. More importantly, it's about thinking about your organization or your personal use of you know, the internet for whatever it is that you do. And think about what your risks are. Every entity is different. We realize we've got big ones, we've got small ones, we've got for-profits and nonprofits. There is no one-size-fits-all. But what there is for all of you is the opportunity to think about how this impacts you. Where are you at risk? What are the things you need to do to protect yourself? But you really can't think about what you need to do to protect yourself if you haven't really thought about where you are susceptible. So we're going to start with a little quiz. You know, you got your threats over to the left, and in your mind, where do you think you are in terms of risk? Is it a low risk to you, a medium, or a high? And then we're going to go through the various sections. So the one would be personnel security. You know, think about background checks. You know, again, some organizations do them, some don't. Sometimes, frankly, a Google search will provide you information maybe that will give you an answer. But you do want to consider the people that you're hiring, the consultants that you are using to ensure that these people can be trusted with your information. Now, when we talk about identification badges with pictures, that may or may not be relevant to you depending on the size of your organization. But what I would tell you is think about the people that are there and do they belong there. So let's say you're a manufacturing company and you have a $650,000 laser. Are the people that are walking around that laser and touching it, are they supposed to be there? Because all you need is one person either downloading a virus or doing something wrong. Your laser's locked up, and what does that cost you until you can get that fixed? If you have a server room with 42 computers and you've got people walking in and out, should they be there? So I guess it's more about thinking about the people that are involved and whether or not those people should be accessing what, you know, where they're at and what they're doing. That includes your accounting department. You know, you've got screens. Do you have people wandering in and out, or can they see the information on the screen? Do you have that information locked in the evening? And this is a really important one. This is termination of access when people leave. And I've been, you know, we've tested this with employees, and it's like, well, Joe was here for 40 years, Joe left. We like Joe. Nobody thought about making sure Joe couldn't access the server anymore. So you want to make sure you've got some lines of communication between your IT department and your HR department to ensure that you are addressing these things. When people leave, you cut off their access. This becomes even more important if unfortunately you've had to lay somebody off or you've had to fire somebody. And this isn't, in my mind, just about can they get into the server. You need to think about what can they access. So is it the server? Is it a portal? Does this person have access to your ADP information online, as in they can change salary information? Can they get onto your 401k plan and move money around? So you need to think about in advance who the people are that have access to online information. And it's going to be different for everybody. If you're in a manufacturing company, maybe all your employees can do is get into an online time card system. So they leave, you cut it off, it's no big deal. But you need to think in advance, maybe by department, who are the people that work for me, what can they access, and if something happens, and it could be the proverbial bus, how do I make sure that we cut off their access and we minimize that risk? Physical security, this is obvious. I think, again, secure visitor credentials, as I said earlier, who's there? Does the person that's there belong there? Computer security policies, this is going to include hardware and software. If you have a server room, if your employees are taking their laptops and they're working at, they're at Starbucks and they're sitting there, is there a policy that if they go to the restroom, they have to pick up their machine? You need to think about, again, the equipment that you have involved, and it could be machines. This is our operational, a point of sale system, or a cash register, laptops, and assess where are our risks and what do we need to do to address the risk, to minimize the risk. You're never going to eliminate them, but you can minimize them. And then again, automatic locking of computer screens. This is probably something, again, for anybody that's got employees that are out. For example, as auditors, we're out and about. We want to make sure our screen's shut off. If somebody is working at the Starbucks, think about if somebody's working at a co-working space. A lot of times, you're in a co-working space. They're glass walls. They're not wall walls. So, think about where you're at and what you need to do. Account security, we cannot say it enough. Passwords, passwords, passwords. You need to change your passwords, make sure they're not, I think we actually, ours have, you have to have so many letters, I guess numbers, I don't know. I have a code, a system I use, so I don't really count. But you want to make sure they can't recycle passwords. It is always a good idea not to use things like your daughter's birthday, your dog's name, because if somebody knows anything about you, a lot of times they can figure that out right away. So you want a system, and you want to make sure it's enforced. For those of you who may outsource your IT function, I would suggest to you that you want this to be part of the services that your IT provider is giving to you, that they are requiring that these passwords get changed and changed on a regular basis. Again, personal use on an organization's devices. You don't want my Gmail account being accessed and me downloading those pornographic pictures that don't exist onto my laptop. So you need to you think about that. I would say the flip side of that is you want to make sure you know what people are doing on their phones or their other, their iPads. That how much, if somebody has a personal iPad, what do you want them doing when it comes to your business? You may be fine with all of it. You just need to make sure it's password protected, possibly that you're doing the two-factor authentication. And an interesting story, when I listened to the FBI guy, he mentioned about there was a company that was very tech-heavy. And I guess the fraudsters were trying to get into this system and they couldn't. There was a bowling alley next to it. So all the IT guys were bowlers. So they would come over and they would bowl. And of course, they're on their phones doing what we do, accessing information. Well, here, the fraudsters figured out what was going on. And so they were able, because these guys were accessing, the unsecured Wi-Fi at the bowling alley, they were able to get in that way. And then therefore, when these people went back to work and started using their phones, they were able to access the information they really wanted. So again, these people are smart. Let's see, confidentiality. Again, consider confidentiality agreements. If you have with your staff, even if you don't consider that necessary, the thing you may want to do is just talk to the people that work with you, whether it's the person that's answering the phone, whether it's the person that's billing. Stress to them the importance of the confidentiality of the information that you have available, the risks that go with that, whether it's a personal risk to them if they're accidentally sending information out, the risk to your company. Because sometimes it isn't that people don't think, it's just that they don't know. So by reinforcing this from the get-go, you start to put it in their head they need to think about it. Data encryption, and also interestingly enough, document shredding and disposal of information. You know, if you think about it, 10, 15 years ago, if you got a credit card bill, your credit card number was on that invoice. If you got a bill from your doctor's office, a lot of times your social security number was your ID. So if you've got boxes of information that's been sitting around for 10 or 15 years, you may very well have personal information in your office that probably shouldn't be there. So you may want to find out what your document retention policies are for your organization, and you want to may work within those parameters. Certainly if you need information on document retention, we can get you something the AICPA has a listing of how long you're supposed to keep information. But you do want to keep this in mind. Also the proper disposal of digital information. So number one, the obvious, you have old computers, that have hard drives on them. They always tell you to wipe them off, pull them out. So you want to make sure you are taking care of that so that there are no old laptops that you've just donated to some nonprofit, and all of a sudden you don't realize you have 1,000 social security numbers on there. So you want to pay attention to that and make sure that you minimize any risk associated with that. Backups. I don't even feel like I need to talk to you about backups. If you're not doing backups, shame on you. Please do backups. You want more than one backup because you need to be sure that if you get locked up, like in a malware situation, sometimes they're going to ask you for Bitcoin, and all the FBI was very clear, don't ever pay them. But the point is, a lot of times, whether they lock your system up or not, it doesn't matter. You're like, go ahead, lock it up. I've got backups from every day. But the other thing to remember with backups is make sure they work. Even if you're using an outside provider, make sure they are backing up the information that they're supposed to be backing up and that it works. Because, again, sometimes people think they're backing up. I think we might have run into this in our own office at some point a long time ago. But it happens. People aren't necessarily doing things wrong on purpose, but it just happens. So make sure you do your backups. You need a disaster recovery plan. And remember, if we're thinking big picture here, a disaster recovery plan is just part of that plan. Again, you need to make sure that employees have different employees responsible for different things. Make sure that that is clear cut. So again, like when I talked about the communication between IT and HR, whether it's IT and HR, whether it's IT and operations, that should be laid out in front so that if something happens, people know they just kick into gear. It isn't everybody scrambling thinking, oh my goodness, what are we supposed to do next? And again, if you're doing an appropriate plan, you're going to be evaluating your emergencies and your hazards. Okay, training and compliance, training for employees. I've mentioned this already. Again, do this often. Do this like with the same people. Don't feel like, okay, somebody walked in the door today, we explained all of this to them, it's covered. When we hire our interns come in early summer, or our new hires come in September, they get the conversation. Then we do firm-wide CPE. Everybody gets the same conversation. Then we do our golf outing in the summer. It's the same thing because you need to repeat things over and over. So, and not only do you need to repeat it over and over, information changes, things change. Some of what Mark was talking about today, we never would have talked about this 5 years ago. There were fraud risks, but the malware, the way it is now, these phishing emails, it's changed a lot. So your training, again, needs to be often, but it also needs to be updated. System-wide tests, it's a good idea to do phishing tests. And we've done them in our office. Sometimes it's a fake email. I got caught on this one. One was a fake link, you know, like when you have LinkedIn, so-and-so wants to link in with you. Of course, me, I'm on LinkedIn all the time. Boom, I clicked it, I got caught. I think I'm still hearing about that from Jeff Ford. And then review of your, audit your policies around cyber. What are they? If you don't have them, create them. But you need to evaluate them and you need to update them and change them. And again, keep them in accordance with the things that are happening in this environment. And then, of course, potentially, if you feel that somebody just is blatantly not paying attention, then you would have to consider disciplinary action. This is just an example of legal issues that came up. UPMC was in a situation where there was a data breach, and you know, the courts felt that they were negligent. So while we talk about this again operationally, but as Mark said, you know, reputationally and from a regulatory standpoint, there are real risks here that go with this if you're not paying attention. Wait, what do I want you here? Best practices. Again, this is in the screen, I mean in the materials, but it's just make sure you've got VPNs, firewalls. This is all pretty self-explanatory because I only have 4 more minutes. Cybersecurity insurance. As part of your plan, consider, I'm not saying purchase, I am saying consider the need for whether or not you need cybersecurity insurance. This is going to be different for everybody. It's going to depend on the kind of information you have, the work that you do, but at least consider it. You know, let's face it, people that sell insurance will gladly come in and they will explain to you the purpose of cybersecurity insurance. So, you know, take advantage of that opportunity, evaluate the different kinds that are out there and whether or not it makes sense for you. And again, maybe today it doesn't make sense, but 3 years from now, maybe your client base has changed, it may make sense. So don't assume once you've made a decision that it does not apply. So at least consider and understand the differences in insurance and whether it's relevant to you. Okay, in case of a breach, and when I talk about breach here, I am talking about a data breach, meaning information, private information, just like the UPMC case that has been breached. There are legal requirements that if you have that type of breach has occurred, you are required to notify the state. But interestingly enough, every state has different reporting requirements. So let's say, for example, you have an office here, but data was breached and you have one in Ohio and one in West Virginia and one in New York. You will need to check with every one of those state providers to determine what information, if any, you need, like what you need to do. And when you get into this situation, besides the reporting requirements, there's a whole host of other things you need to do. You know, a lot of times it's you've got to provide insurance so people can have credit checks. There's a lot of costs involved. So if you're in a data breach situation, the first thing I would tell you is hire an expert. And again, if you have a cyber insurance, there's very likely that person is going to be able to help you walk you through this. But hire an expert. Don't assume you're hitting everything you're supposed to, because unless this happens to you regularly, you probably don't even know where to begin. So recognize if you have a breach, number one, it is a big deal. You need to identify, and you need to hire an expert who will help walk you through this process so you address it appropriately. If you actually feel that you have been victimized, meaning, well, besides the data breach, but in this case we're going to talk money, you can report it to the FBI. They have an Internet Crime Complaint Center. I can tell you, again, having been to the FBI presentation, the local FBI office has a big cyber presence. The gentleman that spoke, that team, he was a member, I think he leads that team, he was incredibly sharp. So if you have an issue and you need to start evaluating how to recoup some money, I think that's a good place for you to start. Now that, and again, I know I've kind of rushed through this. As I said, think about your own situation. What's important to you, where your risks are, where your holes are, and then you can begin to establish your plan and act on your plan. So with a minute to go before the prizes, which is the most important part, does anybody have any questions?